In 216 BC, the Roman Republic was effectively dead. It just didn't know it yet. On the dusty plains of Cannae, Hannibal Barca had just achieved the impossible. In a single afternoon, he had encircled and slaughtered between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a demolition. The scale of the slaughter was so immense that, according to the historian Livy, the Carthaginians collected a bushel of gold rings from the fingers of the fallen Roman nobility. Each ring represented a senator, a magistrate, or a knight. The administrative and financial backbone of the state, wiped out in a matter of hours. By all conventional military logic, the war was over. Rome had no army, no generals, and, most dangerously, no money. But history isn't written by the generals who win the battles. It is written by the treasurers who fund the wars. We all know the story of Hannibal crossing the Alps with his elephants. We know about his tactical brilliance, his ambushes at Lake Trasimene and the Trebia River. But there is a silent war that was fought in the shadows of the Punic Wars, an economic war that is rarely discussed. While Hannibal was a tactical genius, he was fighting a financial system he did not understand. This is the story of how Rome, faced with total annihilation, invented emergency monetary policy. It is the story of how they debased their currency, invented the concept of war bonds, and leveraged the future of their economy to buy their survival today. To understand why Hannibal lost, we have to look at the balance sheets of the two superpowers involved. Carthage and Rome weren't just political rivals, they were opposing economic models. Carthage, based in modern-day Tunisia, was the ancient world's version of a massive trading corporation. It was a maritime empire built on high-velocity commerce. They had the gold. They had the silver mines in Spain. Their economy was liquid, sophisticated, and incredibly wealthy. However, this wealth created a specific military structure, the mercenary model. Carthage didn't have a large citizen body willing to die for the state. Instead, they outsourced their violence. They hired Numidian cavalry, Balearic slingers, and Gallic infantry. This has a huge advantage. You get professional soldiers instantly. You don't have to train a farmer to hold a spear. You hire a man who has been holding a spear his entire life. But this model has a fatal flaw in finance: cash flow. Mercenaries do not fight for patriotism. They fight for silver. If the payroll stops, the army stops. Even worse, if the payroll stops, the army often turns on its employer. Hannibal's army was a terrifying machine, but it was a machine with a massive daily burn rate. Every day his army sat in Italy, it was eating money. He needed a constant stream of high-value coinage to keep his coalition of different tribes and nationalities together. Now, look at Rome. In 218 BC, Rome was an agrarian state. It was land-rich, but cash-poor. They didn't have sophisticated banking or massive gold reserves like Carthage. What they had was the assidui, a class of land-owning citizens who were required to serve in the military. Here is the crucial economic difference. A Roman soldier was fighting for his own farm. He could be paid in promises, in land, or in delayed wages. A Carthaginian mercenary demanded payment now. This meant that Carthage was fighting a war of liquidity. They needed constant cash access. Rome was fighting a war of solvency. They could take on a massive debt as long as they didn't collapse entirely. But after Cannae, Rome's solvency was pushed to the breaking point. Let's go back to the aftermath of Cannae. The panic in Rome wasn't just emotional, it was financial. The state treasury, the aerarium, which was housed in the Temple of Saturn, was empty. Rome had lost 20% of its adult male population in less than 3 years. Imagine the United States losing 60 million men in 30 months. The tax base was dead on the battlefield. The farms that produced the tax revenue were being burned by Hannibal's cavalry. Rome was facing a sovereign debt crisis. They needed to raise a new army to defend the city walls, but they had literally zero silver to pay for it. In a normal ancient state, this is where you surrender. You sue for peace, pay a massive indemnity, and try to rebuild. But the Roman Senate did something that defies economic logic. They forbade the word peace from being spoken in the city. They limited mourning periods to 30 days so that commerce and industry wouldn't stall. Instead of folding, they decided to break the economy to save the state. They appointed a triumvirate of banking commissioners, the Trisviri Mensare, essentially a crisis management team for the National Bank. Their job was to find money where none existed. Their first move was drastic. The state seized trust funds. They took the savings of widows and orphans, promising to pay them back later, effectively nationalizing private savings to fund the war effort. It was a desperate measure that showed just how close to the edge they were. But that wasn't enough. Seizing assets only gets you so far. Eventually, you run out of widows and orphans to tax. They needed to lower the cost of the currency itself. If you can't find more silver, you have to make the silver you do have go further. Before the war, Rome used a heavy silver coin called the quadrigatus. It was a prestigious coin, roughly 6.8 grams of silver, featuring the two-faced god Janus. It projected stability and power. But as Hannibal ravaged Italy, Rome couldn't afford 6.8 grams per coin anymore. So they began to debase it. Archaeological evidence shows a rapid decline in the weight and purity of Roman coinage during this period. The quadrigatus started to shrink. It got lighter. The silver was mixed with copper and other base metals. This is the ancient equivalent of turning on the money printer. Then, around 201 BC, in the darkest depth of the crisis, Rome scrapped their old currency system entirely and introduced a new financial instrument, the denarius. The denarius was lighter, only about 4.5 grams. By switching from the heavy quadrigatus to the lighter denarius, the Roman state essentially created money out of thin air. If you have 100 kilos of silver and you make heavy coins, you can pay 10,000 soldiers. If you make lighter coins, you can pay 15,000 soldiers. This was ancient quantitative easing. Of course, this caused inflation. Prices in Rome skyrocketed. Wheat became expensive. The purchasing power of the average citizen plummeted. But for the state, inflation was a feature, not a bug. It allowed them to pay their debts with cheaper money. It transferred the cost of the war from the treasury to every single person who held a Roman coin. Meanwhile, Hannibal was stuck in southern Italy with a very different problem. He had no mint. He had to pay his troops in plunder. But as the war dragged on, the plunder ran out. He had captured the rich city of Tarentum, but the Romans held the citadel, effectively denying him the contents of the city's treasury. Hannibal was the CEO of a company that had stopped generating revenue. He was relying on capital injections from Carthage, but the Roman navy, funded by that debased denarius, was blocking the supply routes. Rome was printing its way to survival, while Hannibal was slowly going bankrupt. He began to issue coinage in Italy with his own likeness, often overstriking Roman coins. But the volume was never enough to match the industrial output of the Roman mint. Debasing the currency bought Rome time, but it wasn't enough to build a navy. To defeat Carthage, Rome needed to control the sea, and ships are incredibly capital intensive. You need wood, tar, sailcloth, and thousands of rowers who need to be fed every single day. The treasury was still empty. Taxes couldn't be raised any higher on the poor. They were already starving. The census of 209 BC showed that the population of citizens had dropped by nearly half in some areas. There was no more blood to squeeze from the stone. So, in 210 BC, the Roman consul Laevinus gathered the Senate and proposed something radical. He addressed the assembly and essentially said, "We, the leaders, must show the way. We cannot ask the common people to pay if we hold onto our wealth." The senators went home, gathered their gold, their silver plate, and their jewelry, and dumped it into the treasury. It was a mass voluntary donation, but it wasn't just a donation. It was recorded. The names of the contributors and the weight of their contributions were scribed into the state registers. This was the birth of the tributum, structured effectively as a war bond. The wealthy citizens of Rome loaned their private capital to the state to build a new fleet. In exchange, the state promised that when, not if, they won the war, the money would be repaid, likely with interest gained from Carthaginian loot. This transformed the Roman elite from bystanders into shareholders in the war effort. If Rome lost, the senators lost not just their lives, but their fortunes. If Rome won, they would get their capital back, plus a share of the empire's expansion. They had skin in the game in the most literal sense. This created a unified political will that Carthage simply could not match. Compare this to Carthage. The Carthaginian oligarchy was tired of the war. They saw Hannibal as a money pit. When Hannibal asked for reinforcements, the Carthaginian Senate debated the cost. They were worried about their profit margins. They didn't view the war as an existential struggle for survival. They viewed it as a business line that was underperforming. There's a famous story where Hannibal sends his brother Mago back to Carthage. Mago dumps hundreds of those golden Roman rings on the Senate floor to prove their victory. He asks for money and men to finish Rome off. And the opposition party in Carthage, led by a man named Hanno the Great, essentially asks, "If you are winning so much, why do you need more money?" They refused to send him the full support he needed. So, while Roman senators were bankrupting themselves to fund the fleet, Carthaginian senators were withholding funds to protect their personal wealth. That financial misalignment was fatal. The investment paid off. The new Roman fleet, funded by loans and debased currency, cut off Hannibal's supply lines. But the real return on investment came when a young general named Scipio Africanus took command. Scipio understood that you cannot beat Hannibal in Italy. You have to beat his wallet, and his wallet was in Spain. Spain was the source of the silver that paid the Carthaginian armies. Scipio launched a daring invasion of Hispania. He didn't just attack armies, he attacked the cash flow. In a brilliant campaign, he captured New Carthage, Cartagena. When Scipio took New Carthage, he didn't just take a city, he took the central bank of the Carthaginian war effort. He seized the silver mines, the stockpiles of bullion, and the mints. The impact was immediate. Suddenly, the liquidity crisis flipped. Rome, now flushed with Spanish silver, restored the purity of the denarius. They stopped the debasement. They began to pay their soldiers in high-quality coin again. Carthage, cut off from its mines, began to default on its mercenary payments. We see evidence of this in the numismatic record. Carthaginian coins from this late period become rare and debased. In 202 BC, the war culminated at the Battle of Zama. Scipio Africanus faced Hannibal on the sands of North Africa. Hannibal's army was a shadow of its former self, filled with raw recruits and mercenaries who hadn't been paid properly in months. Scipio's army was a well-oiled machine, funded by a resurgent Roman economy. Hannibal was finally defeated. But the economic defeat had happened years prior, when Rome refused to go bankrupt and Carthage refused to spend its savings. The peace treaty that followed, the Treaty of Zama, was the final receipt. Rome demanded an indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver. To put that in perspective, 1 talent is roughly 26 kilograms, or nearly 60 pounds of silver. Rome demanded nearly 300 tons of silver to be paid over 50 years. This effectively stripped Carthage of its working capital for 2 generations. Remember those war bonds the Roman senators bought? This is how they were paid back. The Carthaginian indemnity payments were funneled directly into repaying the Roman debts. The Roman elite who had bet on the state saw a massive return on investment. They became the richest men in the world. The influx of silver was so massive that it fundamentally changed the Roman economy, moving it away from a barter and bronze system to a fully monetized silver economy that would dominate the Mediterranean for the next 500 years. Rome didn't just win a war. They executed a hostile takeover of the Mediterranean economy. They realized that in a war of attrition, finance is the ultimate weapon. You can lose battles, you can lose territory, and you can lose generals. But if you maintain the ability to mobilize capital, you can always buy another army. We often look at history as a series of great men doing great things. We see Hannibal on his elephant, and we see a romantic hero fighting against the odds. But the Second Punic War teaches us a cold, hard lesson about finance. You can be the greatest tactician in history. You can win every battle. You can humiliate your enemy for a decade. But if your enemy has a financial system that allows them to absorb losses, print money, and mobilize the capital of their citizens, and you don't, you will lose. Rome won because it was an elastic economy. It could stretch, debase, borrow, and break without collapsing. Carthage was brittle. It was rich, but it couldn't handle the negative cash flow of a long, grinding war. Hannibal ran out of money before Rome ran out of men. The Roman victory wasn't just a triumph of the legion. It was the triumph of the denarius, the war bond, and the ruthless application of economic power. It set the template for every major war that followed, from the Napoleonic Wars to the world wars of the 20th century. Ultimately, victory belongs to the side with the deepest pockets and the highest tolerance for debt. As we look back at the ruins of Carthage today, we are reminded that wealth is not the same as power. Carthage had wealth, but Rome had the mechanism to turn wealth into power. And in the end, that made all the difference. If you found this deep dive into the financial history of the Punic Wars valuable, consider how these same mechanisms, inflation, debt, and wartime finance, play out in our modern world. The tools have changed, but the economic laws remain the same. Thank you for listening.